In this second video for the Protagoras, we are considering the relevance of pleasure, things that both Socrates and Protagoras can agree on, include the fact that the knowledge itself is powerful. One who has wisdom and has knowledge has something that is valuable and powerful. But they also agree that pleasure is a good. And so they both agree that if pleasure is good, we have this question that arises because sometimes people say that they do what is wrong because they are overcome by the passion. So this is kind of a puzzle. Why could that be if pleasure is good? So, for example, somebody has a second piece of chocolate cake, or somebody who's trying to quit smoking has another cigarette, or whatever it might be. They say that my desire for that, which was wrong, caused me to do something that I know is wrong. How can we explain that? And what Socrates comes up with, the idea is that people choose bad things, not because they are unpleasant immediately, of course, but they choose them because of the immediate pleasure. So again, they are making the judgment that that thing is good because of the pleasure. So it is consistent with the idea that pleasure is a good. The problem is, however, some things that we do are immediately pleasurable, but bad because of consequences later. And so we don't see the big picture and the consequences when it's before us. And that's what we're going to be talking about here, the idea of appearance versus reality. Nearness distorts the vision. So Plato talks about how when something is closer, it appears larger than when far away. And when something is near and making sound, it is louder when it is close up than when it is far away. So being near to something distorts your perspective of it. So in the same way, some things appear to be better, more pleasurable when present in time in front of you rather than later. And that explains, Socrates claims, why it is that we can decide to do something, we judge it to be for our best interest because of the pleasure, but later, reflecting back on what we did, we make a different kind of judgment and say that was not the best thing to do. And the solution here is measurement. So just like with, if you could hold your thumb up close to your eye, it can block out objects that are very large behind it, even buildings, if in the right perspective. But if you could measure things appropriately, right, you could measure your thumb and see that it's an inch or less in width, and you could measure the building and see how many feet wide it is, then you can have that proper assessment of the size of things. So the solution here is measurement. Measuring requires, or we might say is, knowledge. So the idea is just like you could measure a thumb and compare it to the building, even if the thumb is up close and blocking the building, you could make the assessment clearly, which is of course obvious to us. The thumb is of lesser width than the building. But in the same way, what we need to do with pleasures is measure them appropriately. And the problem with acrasia, that is this idea of weakness of the will, of doing something that you know is wrong, is not the passions. You're not overcome by passions, says Socrates, but ignorance is the problem. It's poor measuring. So when the second piece of cake is right in front of you, you don't have the proper perspective of how it will affect you. You judge the pleasure of the cake immediately to be greater than its effect on you later. Whereas later, when you have the better perspective, you could see that that wasn't a good idea. Again, whatever it is you might want to fit in there, a cigarette or some other activity. And the idea is if we could have the proper measurement, that is, have the proper knowledge, or better, wisdom, then we could appropriately avoid such issues. And the confident person and the cowardly person both approach what they are confident about. So keep in mind the context here is a discussion of courage and whether or not it's the same thing as wisdom. Protagoras saying it is not, Socrates making the argument now that it is. And both of them are similar in that they approach what they are confident about. So that's the same. The problem is the courageous are the ones who are confident about what they should be confident about. So the well-trained person for battle can be confident and courageous, understanding that the danger is there, aware that there are things to fear, but still act according to their training. For example, the person who in battle who's poorly trained and decides to go challenge 5 people at once is confident, but not having the right wisdom about it, not having the proper measurement of the situation. So now we can say something about wisdom and the virtues as a whole. We already concluded that the opposite of temperance was folly, and the opposite of folly is wisdom. So that meant that wisdom and temperance are the same thing. And Protagoras is out to show that wisdom is not the same thing as all the virtues by putting forth courage as an example. But now Socrates has the argument that concludes that the ones who are courageous are the ones who have wisdom about what to fear and about what to have confidence toward. So in other words, the opposite of courage is ignorance about what to fear and what not to fear. And so we have the same kind of argument. If the opposite of courage is ignorance and the opposite of ignorance is wisdom, we have the similar kind of reason now so that we conclude that wisdom is courage. In other words, courage is wisdom. In fact, now it seemed like that was the most likely candidate for a virtue not being wisdom. And it seems that all of the virtues are, or at least have an essential component of, wisdom or knowledge. And so now we could see that if they weren't, if it wasn't knowledge, if that wasn't the issue, they wouldn't be teachable. Now we have a kind of an odd situation. There is aporia and confusion, because at this point, Socrates has argued for the claim that Protagoras should have been endorsing, because Protagoras is the one who said that virtues could be taught, and Socrates is the one who questioned whether they could be taught. But now, if virtue is wisdom or a kind of knowledge, then it seems pretty clear that it's something that could be taught. And so maybe we're at a point where we need a more extensive discussion of what virtue is. And we're going to begin with the virtue of justice. And that is the theme for the Republic. And that is our next task, to investigate the nature of justice in the Republic.